Hi, everyone. This is Ellen from the Astrology Journal. So I want to talk about the Septile aspect series, and I also want to talk about the Mars retrograde cycle that we're currently in. So Mars turned retrograde on October 30th, 2022, and it will continue to be retrograde until January 14th of 2023. And then before a planet goes retrograde, it goes through a period where essentially it's going over the territory that it's going to go backwards over. And that period, when it's still going forward, but it's going over that territory, is called a shadow period. And then it goes through its retrograde cycle, and then it goes back over that territory again, and that's called another shadow period. So there are three parts to a retrograde cycle. There's the initial shadow period. I like to call that the reconnaissance period, because it's like it's going over getting a feel for the territory, seeing what's there, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's the retrograde period itself. And then there's the final shadow period. And I like to call that the integration period. So, so this is an important thing in astrology. Like, it has a important symbolic significance. And essentially, it's whenever any planet is doing that, going retrograde, it's in a review, a rethinking, a revisiting cycle. And it's more of an inward directed energy, where we're trying to kind of, you could say, almost like realign or something like that, or reviewing something, going over something. A retrograde, in terms of what's actually happening in the sky, is when a planet, from the perspective of the Earth, appears to be moving backwards. And it's an optical illusion. It isn't actually moving backwards, but it's just how we see it from the Earth. It has to do with the speed, where they are, the speed of the Earth and the speed of the planet, and where they are in relationship to each other. And it'll give the sense, or the perception, that it's going backwards. So that's a retrograde. And again, in astrology, it's symbolically meaningful. In the Mars retrograde cycle, I was interested in the reconnaissance chart. So Mars entered the first shadow period, or the reconnaissance period, on September 3rd, 2022. And there are a couple of septiles in that chart. There's one here. See if I can get it to, there we go. There's one here between Neptune and Venus. And this is a triseptile, and that has to do with the aspect series, and I'll talk about that in a bit. And then there's another one here, and this has to do, involves Neptune. So Neptune's involved in both, and the North Node. And the North Node is our evolutionary trajectory. And this is actually a waning septile, or you could also call it a sextile. It's the final sextile in the series of sextiles, you could say. And so I'll talk more about that later, but I just wanted to note that they're in there. And it's, I looked at the other charts. I didn't see any septiles in any of those. So to me, that was a super interesting thing to note. So Mars is going forward, right? Like, it's like ready to go forward with, whatever. But it's like, wait a minute, there's something here I got to think about before I can, go forward beyond this. And to me, it's interesting that there are septiles involved in that thing that it is reconsidering. That's what I wanted to say. Oh, and then just aspects generally. I guess I probably should talk about that before I dive into the aspects. So what are aspects? Aspects, well, you saw they're relationships between planets. And these lines when you pull up an astrology chart, usually there will be lines like this in the middle of the chart. Those are representing the aspects. And so the aspects are really just angular relationships between planets. One planet is here, but I'll just use Neptune and Venus. One planet, the slower planet in this case, Neptune, is here. Venus, the faster moving planet, is here. So Venus has traveled all the way around the circle to here. And so the aspect is the measurement of that distance between, or the measurement of the distance between two planets. But not every measurement is an aspect. So there are certain ones that are symbolically meaningful, and you can figure out those essentially by dividing the circle by whole numbers. So a circle is 360 degrees. You divide that by 1, you get 360 degrees, and that 360 degrees is the same as 0 degrees. So like you start here at 0 degrees of Aries, you go all the way around to 360 degrees, and you wind up back at 0 degrees. So 0 degrees, 360 degrees is the same thing. And that's called a conjunction. And that has a specific a symbolic meaning. And then if you divide it by 2, you get 180 degrees, and that's two planets exactly opposite each other, 180 degrees apart. And that is, again, it's an opposition symbol, and it's symbolically meaningful. And then you could divide by 3, and you get 120 degrees. That also is a symbolically meaningful degree of separation. And so on. And the septile is dividing the 360 degree circle by 7. And when you do that, you get a funky number. You don't get a whole number. You get instead 51 degrees, 25 minutes, and 43 seconds. So it's not easy to find. It's not easy to spot in the chart. And it's considered what astrologers would call a minor aspect. I think minor isn't necessarily the best name for those. They just mean the ones that, Ptolemy back in the day identified, I think it was 5 aspects, and those are called the major aspects, and they're really easily identifiable in the chart. And then there are other, what they call minor aspects. They're not quite as easy to spot. And I would say that's the real distinction between the major and the minor, is the major are really easy to spot. The minor aren't. Some say the major ones are it's really clear what they're doing, and the minor ones are more subtle in their action. That might be, I'm not really sure about that. I think it's just a matter, I think it's just how are we tuning in maybe, but it's possible. Anyway, so the septile aspect, the 360 degrees divided by 7 is 51 degrees, 25 minutes, 43 seconds. But you can multiply that, and this is when you get aspect series. So you can take an aspect and you can multiply it by 2. And in this case, when we do that, we get 102 degrees, 51 minutes, and 26 seconds. And then we can also multiply it by 3, and we get 154 degrees, 17 minutes, 9 seconds. And we can multiply it by 4, we get 205 degrees, 42 minutes, 52 seconds. We can multiply it by 5, 257 degrees, 8 minutes, 34 seconds. We can multiply it by 6, 308 degrees, 34 minutes, 17 minutes. And then when we multiply by 7, we get back to 0 degrees of Aries. We get back to the start, you could say, of the circle. So that's what an aspect series is when you take the base aspect and you multiply it by 2, then 3, then 4, however many times it's possible to multiply it until you get back to the start. So what I was interested in, so the septile, I can't remember if I talked about this. I've done this video a lot of times, and I don't remember exactly what I talked about in this one. So the septile aspect, when I was first learning about it, and I'm still new to learning about it, but when the first time I was thinking about it and wanting to understand it, I kept coming across this idea of fate and destiny. And that felt like something that you kind of go through life, and it's like you just take it for granted, like fate and destiny. But I realized I didn't really understand what it meant. And I wanted to, and especially I didn't understand how to understand that in a chart. If I saw 2 planets in a septile relationship to each other, and it's about fate, well, what does that mean exactly? I don't really. And when I say what does that mean, I'm like, well, how can I work with that? That's maybe the most important thing. How can I work with that? And it seems like fate isn't anything you can work with because it just is, right? But I don't think that's true. So anyway, I was trying to sort this out. And what I decided to do is figure out where 51 degrees, 25 minutes, 43 seconds fell on the natural wheel, and see if that gave me any insight. And it falls at 51 degree, 21 degrees, 25 minutes, and 43 seconds of Taurus. So each of these signs is 30 degrees. So if we start at 0 degrees of Aries, we go 30 degrees, and then we go 21 more degrees to get to 51 degrees. So each of these lines are 10 degrees. So 30 to 40, 40 to 50, and then 51. So it falls at 51 degrees, or I'm sorry, it falls at 21 degrees, 25 minutes, and 43 seconds of Taurus. And so that's interesting. Taurus has to do with our resources, our inner and our outer resources. The outer resources are the land, and I would say more broadly, it's the earth and all that the earth gives us to sustain us. And then the inner resources are our gifts and our talents and our self-relationship and our, the feelings that we feel. Taurus is about the senses. And so, it's how we experience, you could say, our environment, how we interpret that through our senses, and then the feeling we feel, and that helps us to establish our relationship with ourselves. In a very basic way, we want to we gravitate towards what feels good, and if we think about that in a healthy way, not a dysfunctional or addictive way, that's a really positive thing. Our feeling senses help us navigate our world because it says, yes, this is good, go towards this. No, this is not good, go away from that. That's kind of the very basic, you could say, function of feelings in my way of understanding it. And so we want to feel. So we all kind of have our gifts and talents, and it's like we want to have external resources that can support us in our relationship with ourselves, can support us in our relationship with our gifts and talents. And those gifts and talents that, when we feel good, maybe those are the ideal ones to go for. But the whole point of this is that the idea of fate, if we consider where 51 degrees falls on the astrology wheel, it's tied up with this idea of Taurus, or this idea of our inner and outer resources. And so it's this idea of, do we have the outer resources to support and sustain us? And do we, and to just sustain us, but then also to help us to develop that self-relationship and our relationship with our gifts and talents. And if we don't have that, then that might mean that our fate is going to be different than if we did have that. If we did have that, maybe we can show up more, you could almost say, for our fate, something like that. So that's just something to think about. To me, that was really helpful. It's like, oh, okay. So fate has something to do with what we innately are and what is abundantly available to us, really. Although things can get kind of screwed up and there can be a disconnect, and we might not get those things that we need to be able to support and sustain ourselves. And depending on that whole thing, that will kind of shift the fate, you could say, that we experience. That's how I'm thinking about it. And then if you think about the aspect series as kind of like this unfolding story, well, then it goes over to 102 degrees, which is in Cancer. That is at 12 degrees of Cancer. And Cancer is emotions. It's the water, right? So it's wonderful to have the gifts and the talents and all those things. But if they're not watered, if they're not nurtured, if you think about a plant in the earth, if it doesn't receive water and nutrients from the soil and all that kind of stuff, it's not going to grow very well. So there needs to be this kind of water, and I think of this in the form of nurturance. Cancer is about the mother or the primary caregiver in the infant and the child. And so we need that care. We need that water of care to be able to blossom, you could say. So that's part of the septile journey, you could say. And that's the biseptile part of the journey. And it's emotional connection too. If you think about having gifts and talents, especially if you think about like the arts, if it's devoid of emotion, it's sort of devoid of life. So in a sense, this is kind of the life-giving part of the septile journey, as I think about it in the moment. And then it goes on to the triseptile, 154 degrees, which is about 4 degrees of Virgo. And Virgo is the second earth sign. Taurus is the first earth sign. So this is our resources, right? And then and especially the inner resources or the outer resources too. And then what Virgo does is it establishes a practice and it develops skill and it develops craft. So it learns how to shape the outer resources, if we're talking about, maybe clay or something like that. Or maybe learns how to make the food or whatever. It develops its particular skill or craft. And then whatever our gifts and talents are inwardly, maybe we're a singer or whatever. So we're learning, how to train our voice and all that kind of stuff. So that's what Virgo's about. And you can see that if we never had good resources to start with, or we never were able to understand what our gifts and talents are, or we're never able to get in touch with our self-relationship, well, that's going to make the Virgo experience different than if we had those from the start and had those set up in a positive way from the start. So that would affect our fate, right? And so then we go on to Libra. And so this is a quad septile, and that's 205 degrees, which is about 25 degrees of Libra. And this is our relationship with the other. And Virgo comes just before Libra. And to me, Virgo is, so in Libra, we want to come together in one-on-one relationships as equals. And in order for that to work, we both have to have developed our gifts and talents so that we have those, we can give ours and we can receive theirs. And so it's this give and take relationship, you could say. And it's really dependent on how well we do in terms of the Virgoan you could say developmental task of developing ourselves and our gifts and talents. But also Venus is ruled by Libra. I'm sorry, Libra is ruled by Venus, and so is Taurus. So in evolutionary astrology, they talk about the inner side of Venus, which is Taurus, and the outer side of Venus, which is Libra. So this is our self-relationship. We're learning to feel and within ourselves and also listen. Venus is also listen within. And then in Libra, we're learning, this is our relationship with other. We're learning to listen to the other and kind of this give and take of listening, you could say, and feeling one another also and all of that sort of thing. But Ideally, Libra is about relationship of equals, and there's this harmonious kind of balance going on. But Libra can also express as imbalance and extremes, and this is something I learned from evolutionary astrology. And so, if it's my way of interpreting that is if it's expressing as extremes, it means that there's something's off. There's something off, and it can be anything. We can look at all of the different, I like to think in terms of developmental tasks. It's not necessarily the best way to describe it, but if we think of each sign as representing some sort of developmental task, what's off here, we can look back and say, okay, well, where is it here? What's missing from all of this that came before. And the place that I especially want to look is Taurus, because it's also ruled by Venus and it's about our self-relationship. So is this imbalance in relationship indicating that something's off in our own self-relationship? So we can think of it as like a mirror back to us of where we're at. And we don't have to take that as some kind of way to blame ourselves. We can just see that as information that we can use to compassionately understand ourselves and what was missing and how can we go back and how can we, go back maybe isn't the best term, but how can we rebuild or build those foundations or rebuild those foundations? How can we restore our relationship with ourselves, et cetera, in order to establish peace and harmony and balance in relationships? But if our relationships, in terms of this idea of fate, if our relationships are in balance, that's also going to affect our fate. That's going to affect our experience of our lives. You can almost think of fate as what comes to us, what we experience in our lives, in a way. And what we experience in our lives depends in part on how well we're able to show up for our lives. So that's just one thing, again, that I'm thinking of. So the next one is the penta or the quinta septile. I'm not sure what the formal name is. 257 degrees, and that puts it at 17 degrees of Sagittarius. Sagittarius, the way that I'd be thinking about it, the way that I've been thinking about Sagittarius a lot lately is just the stories we tell. So if all of this before Sagittarius went really well, the stories we're going to tell here are going to be really good. So they're going to be like reinforcing, they're positively reinforcing or reinforcing in a positive way. And so that's making our fate even bigger in a positive way. You could say Sagittarius makes things bigger, or Jupiter makes things bigger, and Jupiter rules Sagittarius. If these, something in here didn't go well, and we're kind of inclined to tell negative stories, then that's going to also affect our fate, and it's going to create kind of a negative cycle, or it's reinforcing a negative cycle, you could say, and that's going to affect our fate. We may dismiss something that was a sure thing just because we don't understand it was a sure thing and we assume it isn't. And by dismissing it, we may miss an opportunity that actually might have been really good for us. It might not have been good for us, but let's just pretend it was good for us. So that would affect our fate. And then the final, the sexta septile, this falls in Aquarius at 8 degrees of Aquarius, 308 degrees of the circle, 8 degrees of Aquarius. And this is super interesting that it doesn't fall in Capricorn, because the first two Earth signs are involved in this aspect series, but the final Earth sign isn't. And it's particularly interesting because Capricorn itself has something to do with this idea of fate and destiny. But it's not involved in the Septile series. Super interesting. Instead, Aquarius is. And Aquarius is the individualized self. The Capricorn is more the conforming self, you could almost say. It's a self that's wanting to master something. It's more about tradition and mastery. And a lot of times mastery is about following a tradition or following things that have come before. Aquarius wants to break out of that, and it wants to become its own unique self. And so the start of the Septile aspect series is Taurus, our self-relationship and our feeling ourselves and being in relationship with that which sustains us. And it ends with a fully individualized, with the idea of the fully individualized human being, and also the idea of the fully individualized, fully enlightened community. So the fully enlightened individual and the fully enlightened community. And so that's the end point of the Septile series. It's not Capricorn. It's not mastery. It's not conformity. It's not fitting in. It's not tradition. It's breaking free of all that. So it's just an interesting thing to think about, that the story of the Septile ends in Aquarius. And so if any of these things weren't met along the way, it's going to be harder for us to break free and become a truly own individualized being. Maybe we'll get stuck. Maybe mastery isn't a bad thing. I'm a Capricorn, so maybe mastery isn't a bad thing, but it's getting stuck there. Like you can't. The problem I can see with Capricorn is that it never breaks out and finds its own way. Like, you might have to do that for a while. You might have to do what the tradition has been to kind of start to groove something. But there comes a time when you have to find your own way with something. And so that would be a trap for Capricorn, is not finding its way to itself, you could almost say. And the Fate aspect series, the Septile aspect series, is saying that the outcome is this, the individualized self. So it wants to break free of this, you could almost say. I don't know if any of that made sense, but that's what I have to say about it. And then so looking at these septiles in the Mars reconnaissance chart from September 3rd, 2022, again, we have this Neptune, which is a dreaming function. It's awareness. It's awareness. It's a dreaming function. It can also be illusion, and it can be confusion. But if we think about it as a dreaming function, and it's in a relationship, a triseptile relationship with Venus. And that triseptile, remember, goes back to Virgo, this Virgo sense of developing the practice, developing the skill. And so when you think in terms of Neptune and Venus, by the way, rules Taurus, which is where the Septile series starts. So the way that I think of Neptune and Pisces is the idea of the dream, and we want to dream the dream. And Neptune also is letting go. It's also grieving. It's also all sorts of those things. But I especially think about it, especially when it's at 24 degrees. In other words, the last part of Pisces right now. That it's really about the dreaming function. The dream is the dream. And then we take that dream into Aries, the seed, and it's like we plant the dream as the seed, and the seed, it then blossoms, but it's the dream that's blossoming. And so we are wanting to develop skill in dreaming. It's like and it's also about hope. So we want to develop skill in doing that. It's because if with Pluto going through Capricorn, it's almost like we've lost that ability. Our dream has been dictated by all the ideas that have come before, all the traditions, all the ideas about how we conform and that sort of thing. You know, we get the picket fence, we get the house with a picket fence, and 2.5 kids and the whatever. And it's like that all was given to us, and it's almost like we never really thought about what are our own dreams. And so so it's like this dreaming muscle, you could say, is atrophied. And so we want to develop the skill of that. To me, that's how I would think about that. And then the other thing too is, how do we know what dreams are the dreams we want to dream? Well, how do they feel? So we want to develop that skill too, of tuning into how things feel. And that can be kind of a tricky thing. That can be a little bit confusing, because it's like we may be out of touch with what genuinely feels good versus what's the buzz or the glitter or the glamour or whatever. So we have to kind of find our way through that. But this to me feels like it's an opportunity. And then the other septile is Neptune and the North Node. And this is that waning septile, which goes back here. And that brings us to the septile in Aquarius. So we have that idea of the individuated self breaking free of the traditions and the norms. And the North Node, which is our evolutionary trajectory, we as humans, in my interpretation of this, are really wanting to become fully individualized human beings at this time. That's kind of what this is about. The North Node being conjunct Uranus. Uranus rules Aquarius. That idea, again, we want to break free. We want to become our fully individuated human selves, fully realize our potential. And when we do that, we can share our fully realized potential with the rest of the collective, with the group. And that's how we become enlightened. And so this idea of the dream of the fully individuated self, of breaking free of the norms and traditions, not to destroy anything, but to take it to the next level, to do what needs to be done next, which is break out of the mold, which carries us so far. But eventually, we have to become our own people, our own individual beings. And so that's just food for thought. I mean, there's a lot going on in this chart. And so this is only these two Septile series aspects are just a small part of what's going on in this chart. But it really struck me that they were there, especially because I didn't see them in the other charts. I'll have to look again. I often make mistakes, but we'll see. Maybe, but maybe it's a good mistake, because maybe it was just telling me I needed to focus on this. I don't know. Anyway, I hope that made some sort of sense. I'm going to leave it there, and I will do other videos at some point. I'm not sure when. Okay. All right. Take care. Bye.